Is this now working? Yeah, to host Benjamin Perrin and Sarah OJ today. Before we start, I will give it over to Dr. Kevin Haggerty, who is the chair of the Department of Sociology, to do our land acknowledgement, and I will then properly introduce Ben and Sarah.
Yeah, just reiterating what Sandra said, it's great that everyone's here, and I just want to start things off in a good way by acknowledging that the University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we're located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saltno, and Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. So looking forward to this.
Before I will continue, we will make sure that you will find your seat. Yeah, we will make it happen. Watch the cables.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm going to head back.
Okay, so it's my sincere pleasure to introduce Ben Perrin and Sarah OJ today. I know some of you were expecting Petra Schulz, who can't be with us today, but Sarah will be speaking on her behalf. Ben is a professor of law at the University of British Columbia, and he researches and teaches in the areas of criminal law and international law. Before joining UBC in 2007, he served as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada and also advised judges at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Special Court for Sierra Leone. He was lead criminal justice advisor and in-house legal counsel to the Prime Minister of Canada, and he's just published a new book, which is why you are all here, which is called Indictment, the Criminal Justice System on Trial. And then our second speaker today is Sarah OJ. She is an advocate for Moms Stop the Harm, a community and advocacy organization that you probably know a lot about. They are working tirelessly on drug policy reform aimed at reducing harm with substance abuse. Sarah is also an assistant professor in our Department of Education at the University of Alberta. And it's my sincere pleasure to have you both here, and I will give it over to you guys.
Thank you all for coming. Such a pleasure to be here at the University of Alberta. I want to start by passing the mic over to Sarah, and that's good. That's a theme you're going to hear in this research in this book. I think one of the biggest reasons why our criminal justice system is so flawed, and the reason that our society is so horribly messed up right now, is that we don't spend enough time having people who are impacted by these systems sharing. And so that's what we're trying to do in most of the cities we go to. There are people who have, in many different ways, had their lives impacted by these systems. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Sarah. Thank you for coming today, especially on such short notice. And then after Sarah shares, I'll come and talk about the book.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to apologize for reading right off of a page. I don't trust myself at the very last minute to wing it. So I'm a citizen of Mi'kmaq Cree First Nation, which is located in and around Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. This is where my father's family is from. My mother's family is Métis from Lac Saint Anne, which is just west of the city. As mentioned, I'm a newly hired assistant professor in the Faculty of Education. And I'm also a local advocate with Moms Stop the Harm. So Moms Stop the Harm is a network of Canadian families impacted by substance use related harms and deaths. We advocate for the change of failed drug policies, provide peer support to grieving families, and assist those with loved ones who use or have used substances. The last 11 months have seen me become an accidental advocate for drug policy reform. It has been a steep learning curve, one that I have been trying to navigate since losing my 31-year-old son, Lakota, to fentanyl on December 19th of last year. Dr. Perrin's book Overdose has been instrumental in helping me to understand the scope of the drug poisoning crisis, which took my son's life. His book Indictment, is an incredible record which speaks directly to how my son's substance use disorder became amplified through his interactions with the criminal justice system. Lakota was a very curious, empathetic, kind, intelligent, and some would say very overactive child. He was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactive disorder at 4 years old, with oppositional defiant disorder at 9 years old, and then with conduct disorder at 14. He was forced out of school at 15 years old when he was declared 16 for the purposes of the School Act. He started exhibiting deep depressive episodes at an early age. The first time I took him to the emergency room for suicidal ideation was at 14 years old. He lost his father when Lakota was only 3 years old. Extensive trauma and the mental health issues arising from that trauma led him to his initial drug of choice, which was alcohol, which he began using problematically from the time he was 16 years old. Lakota was a binge drinker. He did not drink every day and would often have long periods of time between these binges. He was an occasional drug user at the time as well, preferring mostly weed. This all changed after the first time he was arrested and incarcerated at the age of 24. He was held in the Edmonton Remand Center for, it was about 4 or 5 months. When he came out into the community, he had changed. He had become hardened. He had become violent, which he had never been before. And his addictions became further entrenched. After this first time in remand, he started using coke and meth on a more regular basis. Lakota cycled in and out of remand and provincial jail for 5 years, spending most of his time in isolation. He was released for the last time from jail in March 2020. He wanted to change his life. Together, we got him an apartment after I agreed to co-sign his lease. It gave him the security and independence to start to rebuild his life. By the next year, he had found employment working at Camp Row. He was working towards rebuilding his relationship with his daughter after being gone for much of her young life while incarcerated. Lakota wanted to live. He wanted to see his daughter grow up. He wanted to marry the very lovely woman he had met in 2021. He had been drinking and using off and on during this time, binging every 3 to 4 months, but always returning to a stable state after his binge, continuing to work on himself. Over the years, Lakota had expressed a desire to go to treatment a few times, but whenever I called to inquire about a treatment bed, I was told the wait could be anywhere from 1 to 3 months. 2 months before his death, he was evicted from his apartment for non-payment of rent. I had been helping him keep afloat and stay housed by getting into significant debt myself for the last 2.5 years of his life. And the money had run out on his end and on mine. So for 2 months, he lived with me and he was sober while we tried to get him on his feet again. One night of drinking at the beginning of December of last year led to an arrest. And after he was released, he spiraled, ending up first on the street and then in a hotel room. Where my parents, his grandparents, found his lifeless body. It took 12 days from that night of drinking to his death. His tolerance level was down. The riskiest time for a person to succumb to death due to a toxic drug supply is in the first 2 to 3 weeks after a period of sobriety. Which leads me to the after effects of the loss of my son on my entire family. Specifically, after Lakota died, my cousin, who was also a heavy drinker and a recreational drug user, started drinking and using more heavily. He felt a lot of guilt. He had been employed at the same place for 2 decades, and when his alcohol and drug use became more problematic in those months, his workplace forced him into treatment if he wanted to keep his job. Within 3 weeks of leaving treatment, we lost him too in June of this year. He was 42. He left behind a twin brother who is also now dealing with problematic substance use. And we're keeping a really close eye on him. The ripple effect of Lakota's death on my family has been immense, and we are still struggling with putting the pieces back together. Lakota didn't die from his addictions, not really. Given more time and better information about what harm reduction is and what it can do to save life, he might have reached his goals of getting married, watching his daughter grow up, becoming a small engine mechanic, and possibly having more children, his greatest wish. No, he didn't die from his addictions. He died from an unregulated, toxic, illicit drug supply. To identify the solution, you have to understand the problem. It's not an opioid crisis, nor is it an addictions crisis. Opioids are vital medications safely used every day and appreciated by anyone who has had a complicated medical procedure. Of the over 1,800 deaths we had in Alberta last year, nearly 95% were from unregulated drugs, mostly fentanyl. People might use pharmaceutical drugs in ways that become problematic, but very few die from them. We know from the stories of our Mom Stop the Harm families that those who die include people who use occasionally. People might use regularly but without problems, or ones like a 13-year-old girl in Calgary whose mother is now in our grief group. Here in Alberta, the government is proposing involuntary care as the solution to the crisis. A solution that illustrates that our government does not understand the problem. Both my son and my cousin died within 2 to 3 weeks of an extended period of sobriety. My cousin was forced into treatment. Treatment and abstinence will not work if the person is not ready for it. Involuntary care is not only ineffective, but dangerous, as it causes more people to hide their use, and they are less likely to reach out. It is also a grave violation of human rights. Using substances from the unregulated market means a high likelihood to be criminalized for possession, trafficking, which can include buying for and sharing with a friend, and trying to secure the funds to buy drugs. Some of our members' children have faced more serious charges, such as manslaughter for selling and sharing drugs that lead to an accidental drug poisoning death. As the war on drugs saved lives, 5 Alberta families arranging funerals every day will tell you otherwise. So what is the solution to the crisis? In my opinion, it's simple, but at the same time complicated, because it will require a paradigm shift in political will that is currently lacking in this country. Ultimately, people like my Lakota will continue to die in ever-increasing numbers until we legally regulate all substances with a public health focus. Providing access to regulated substances to people who use will not only save lives, it will reduce healthcare costs and significantly cut crime rates. So what about the children? Something we get asked a lot, I think. When I think about the children, I think about my granddaughter, who is today 9 years old, having to grow up without her father. I think about the thousands of children today who are having to grow up without their mothers or fathers. And I think about the intergenerational trauma that Indigenous people are carrying through former harmful practices, laws, and policies. Lakota was an intergenerational survivor, as am I. I can trace a direct line between my grandma's time in the Holy Angels Residential School in Fort Chip to my son's death. We have 2 big events that are most often referred to when talking about Indigenous people's trauma: the Indian residential schools and the 60s scoop. The latter is somewhat of a misnomer because the apprehension of Indigenous children has continued unabated to this day. I think about the new trauma that the children of people who have died from the toxic drug supply are going to carry throughout their lives. First Nations people in both Alberta and BC are 7 times more likely than anyone else to die from drug poisoning. Since 2016, First Nations people in Alberta's life expectancy rate has dropped by 7 years, largely due to the toxic drug supply. So what about the children? When can we move forward with policies that reflect the actual crisis and save more children from having to lose their parents? Is the government of Canada going to have to issue yet another apology 20 to 30 years down the road, this time to a much wider swath of people? My son was addicted to alcohol and drugs. This is true. But he was so much more than his use. He was a generous and kind man and a wonderful, wonderful father who was in a lot of pain. He should still be alive, and he didn't deserve to die. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing. And I haven't heard her story before, because you heard Petra was going to come, and I just saw a lot of folks impacted by it as you were talking. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge there's many people. I've got a mic on here, so I'm good. Yeah, thanks. There's many people in the room who've also lost people close to them. These aren't academic subjects. A lot of times, you know, in universities, we're just talking about policies. This isn't like, should we have more bike lanes? Right? It's not that kind of topic. So I just wanted to acknowledge that too. So I'm going to talk about the unregulated drug crisis in the context of this book, because it plays a huge role in the criminalization of folks. This book for me started 5 years ago as I was researching the unregulated drug crisis, and I got a letter in the mail from an Indigenous man who was being incarcerated in British Columbia. It was an 8-page letter. It was handwritten. Came to my office. I had no idea who this person was, and he didn't ask me for anything. Often people really desperate, can't afford a lawyer, they're going to get even more desperate and they'll contact a law professor. That's how desperate you get. And I wasn't practicing, I'm not at the time. So I'd refer folks out, you know, to people who could help them, hopefully. But that's the easy thing to do. I couldn't do that because he didn't actually ask for any legal help. He just wanted to share his story. And this is one of the lines in his letter that I didn't have to go back and like check the letter. This was like burned into my mind the moment I read it. He said, if you want to turn a man into an animal, put him in a cage without the resources to build himself back up. And I found this incredibly disturbing. Most of my work up to this point in my career had been supporting victims of crime, trying to get involved on this unregulated drug crisis issue. I hadn't shown any indication that I would care at all, to be honest, about the conditions behind bars. You heard a few minutes ago in the introduction that I was a lead criminal justice advisor to former prime minister. It wasn't mentioned who it was. How many people know who that was? Yeah, some of you do. We're going to get a big surprise. It's Stephen Harper. So what was an Indigenous man locked in jail? At this point, 2018, I hadn't come out and talked about any of this other stuff. This letter it hit me over the head like a 2x4. So I kept coming back from teaching, and the letter was sitting there on my desk. Around the same time, Jody Wilson-Raybould, Canada's first and to date only Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, who is Indigenous, had this huge, broad public consultation. I actually came to Edmonton as part of that Western Canada consultation. One of the questions that she asked was, if you could design a new criminal justice system from scratch, what would it look like? How bad does it have to be for the government of Canada to ask that question? Okay. How bad does it have to get? We're talking about burn the thing to the ground and start over. That's how bad it's gotten. So I had this letter and this question, and that's what was the spark for this book. So I set out to interview folks who had worked in and around the system, some of them their entire lives. We talked to corrections officers, we talked to police chiefs, we talked to people who work with folks with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, we talked to people who work in victim services, and I interviewed Indigenous leaders and elders, Crown prosecutors, defense lawyers, public health experts, all these people who in university parlance are called experts. You actually have to check a box when you seek ethics approval to interview people, and these are called expert interviews. These are expert interviews. Well, we realized pretty quickly that they had some important things to say, but they weren't the real experts. One of the folks I talked to in the course of this first round of interviews was Harold Johnson. How many people know Harold Johnson? Read his books? Okay, so hopefully you'll buy a few books today. One of them maybe this one, but also Harold's books. He wrote a book called Peace and Good Order: The Case for Indigenous Justice in Canada. Harold's a really unique person. He passed away recently, but he was both a Crown prosecutor and a defense lawyer, and he's a Cree man, Harvard educated. And he went into the system to try to change it, to try to make it, first of all, protect Indigenous people who are being harmed in their communities. And then he saw that it was actually hurting the very people who he was trying to have prosecuted. So he went to become a defense lawyer. And then after the third time, as he describes it, that someone who was engaging in horrific abuse of their spouse got off charges because of Harold's great work as a defense lawyer. Harold says, he said, the next time you get charged, I'm going to be taking you out back of the community hall and giving you a licking. Harold realized he was not changing the system, it was changing him. So his book is like a mea culpa around how the criminal justice system is a system. No matter how well-intentioned people are, no matter how good their goals, they're part of this system. Now, the reason I bring Harold up is for two reasons, really. One is just to get back to what you shared, Sarah. I mean, Harold talks in his work, in his interview with us, he says there's really three moves that the Canadian state has done. First is it, for Indigenous peoples, it created the trauma and the harm. It created the trauma and the harm through the residential schools, through the scoops, through lack of funding for everything from clean drinking water to education, as we're going to hear, Indigenous-led policing and peacekeeping. So it created the harm and the trauma, step one. Step two, it gave the solution. First, the introduction of alcohol. Harold's second book is called Firewater: How Alcohol is Killing My People and Yours. And in Saskatchewan, Indigenous leaders who were negotiating the number of treaties in Saskatchewan knew how devastating alcohol was in their communities. So they had it included in the treaty that alcohol would be kept out of the territory. And that's in the treaty. You can go and look at it, it's in the treaty. But rather than respect that treaty commitment to keep alcohol out, what did they do? They criminalized Indigenous people for having alcohol or for being intoxicated.
Yeah.
So it's a three-step play. You create the problem through the trauma, you provide a so-called solution of alcohol and now synthetic drugs like fentanyl, and then you punish those very folks for turning to those pain medicines. I didn't know what fentanyl was when I first started researching it. It's a pain medication created in the lab in 1959 for people who were dying of cancer. It's a palliative care medicine. It's used in veterinary care. If you have a cat or dog or yourself has gone through any kind of medical procedure where you were put under, or for pain after the fact, or for some other cause, chances are you've had fentanyl. I've had fentanyl, and it was in those settings. So this is the conundrum that we're in. But what does our criminal justice system do? Well, it mainly ascribes blame. I teach criminal law, and the main overarching principle of why we punish people and why we hold them guilty is because what they did was morally blameworthy. That's the term in the code. And that makes them deserving of punishment and stigma. That's literally in the law. It's not just we should lower stigma, it's literally in the law. So that's the first reason I bring up Harold, is he explains, I think, really clearly the underlying causes and roots of a lot of the harm and problems that we see in our communities. The second thing he does is he calls out folks like me. He says we need to stop with the conferences, stop with the talk. He says your ideas are too little, too late. Too little, too late. There's a very popular saying that I hear from folks, people who use substances will bring it forward at rallies and protests, say, they talk, we die, right? They talk, we die. And so Harold says, rather than having these conferences like I've been to, these 5-star hotels with judges, I've been in the cabinet room in Ottawa with these beautiful buffet lunches that they serve the cabinet ministers. I've been to the biggest academic conferences around the world. And never once did I see someone who had spent a day in prison, for example, speak at these events. 2 weeks ago in Saskatchewan, we were having a number of events like this. In the Saskatoon, we had some members of a group called Straight Up. If you don't know what Straight Up They're incredible folks. Hundreds of people have left these violent street gangs, many of them Indigenous. And one of them came and shared their stories with us, Chantel. It's online if you want to check it out. I can share the link with you later. And she had a meeting recently with Corrections Service Canada, who runs our federal penitentiaries, and asked them, she said, how many people do you have working in Corrections Service Canada, in your federal headquarters in Ottawa, who spent a single day in one of your cages? What do you think the answer was? Zero. Not now, not ever. So this gets back to what I was saying earlier. What the biggest problem is with the systems that we have is the people who are the real experts in them, including people who are incarcerated. We're also going to talk in a minute about survivors and victims of crime. Also left, we assume what they want. We assume that they all want to lock them up and throw away the key. Turns out that's not the case. That's not what everybody wants. In fact, that's not what most survivors say they want. So the title for the book is Indictment, the Criminal Justice System on Trial. So we went and interviewed a whole bunch of other people. We sent out a research poster across Canada. We had people who participated, included from here in Alberta and here in Edmonton. People who'd spent time in Edmonton Institution, for example, okay? And they shared with us what their experience was like. That was all we asked. That big bold letters on the poster was, what was your experience like? So each chapter in the book starts with one of their stories in detail. Not what did they do at the moment that they were arrested for what they did, but the full picture. People who responded to our poster, and we got flooded with requests, we had to stop taking people's contact info. They each shared two things, almost everybody, two things. One is that they had never had the chance to tell their story to anyone, ever. And secondly, if it could help just one person, that they wanted to do it. Now, after I'd written the book, I realized, I'm like, well, I heard these stories. This had a huge impact on me. These are the witnesses as we put the justice system on trial. They're the witnesses. They're not used to being the witnesses. They're used to being the accused people or the victim complainants who are sitting in the back room while the deals get discussed, but they're not a part of. So they're the witnesses, but I realized like reading is one thing, not everyone reads books, and even if you do, it's not quite the same. So we went back to them and got their permission. Many folks agreed, and we put out a podcast. So have anyone checked that out yet? Has anyone heard about that? Yeah, a few people. Okay, cool. So it's the same title as the book. It's free, and you get to hear their story for yourself. So I'm not going to share their stories today. That's for them to share through the book, through the podcast. What I want to do is highlight a couple of the big themes and then talk about how we could do things differently. This book is not just about complaining and critiquing. That's the first half. The second half is how we could do things differently. So these are some of the big themes. There's 7 of them, so a couple more to come. First of all, trauma. You've heard that word before a couple times today. It is the common thread that ran through almost every single story. It ran through every story I heard. Virtually every interaction in the criminal justice system, we can't really understand without understanding trauma. One example of this, people who experience 5 out of 10 of those adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma, these are things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse or neglect, the incarceration of a parent, living with a family member with mental health disorder, witnessing family violence. There's other ones too, like poverty, racism, and others that the research has found. But someone who's experienced about 5 out of 10 of the original ACEs, as they're called, they're 50% more likely to hurt someone else later in life. This saying, hurt people, hurt people. Okay? Now, none of this excuses or justifies that. That's not why we're talking about this. But if we want to better understand how to address harm in our society, we need to understand the roots of it, the intergenerational roots and these roots in early childhood. The other thing that kind of blew my mind, and I've done work, like I said, for years, or well over a decade or two, on victims of crime and survivors, was that someone who experiences that type of childhood trauma, they're 8 times more likely to be sexually victimized as an adult. So this is like what they call the cause of causes. These levels of childhood trauma are highest among Indigenous peoples. They're higher among women and girls than in men and boys. They're higher in gender diverse, gender non-conforming communities as well. And essentially groups that are already marginalized by society and are not at the forefront. By Black people, people of color, okay? People who are not like me, right? So fact is that trauma is not randomly distributed throughout society. It makes us more vulnerable to harm and to harm others. Next up was substance use. Between 70 and 93% of people who are in jails or prison have a substance use disorder. That's again an insanely high number. People's substance use disorders, as Sarah, as you shared a minute ago, and these stories are not just anecdotes. We also back them up with the statistical studies and peer-reviewed studies as well. People get worse, not better, in prison. A couple of years ago, one of your former premiers, Jason Kenney, tweeted out information about Albertans who had died of unregulated drugs. And he said that 50%, half of everyone who died, had been in custody at some point in the last 2 years, 50%. In BC, when we did a study, our coroner, Lisa Lapointe, some of you maybe followed her, she does incredibly important work and advocacy for evidence-based ways to deal with this problem. They did a review of every single person who had died, every single person who had died of unregulated drugs in a 1.5 year period. And they found that 2/3 of people, had spent time in custody. So why is that? Why is it after being in a forced detox, which is what prison is for a lot of people, there's still widespread access to drugs, but they're way more unstable and way more rampant violence? The reason is that people's tolerance when they have something like an opioid use disorder rapidly goes down as they use less or they stop using. And it just takes a few days or a couple of weeks. So when we interviewed folks who had been released from prison, who knew this is the crazy thing, they knew this. One man said, I knew it was a risk, so I took what he described as a crumb of what he would normally take. And he was immediately on the floor. Fortunately, there was someone there to help him. There was someone there to help me survive, to tell us his story. So that's one of the reasons why incarceration kills. Incarcerating people with a substance use disorder is like a death sentence. Yeah. Okay, it's like a death sentence. We formally abolished the death penalty, but we effectively have the death penalty for people with substance use disorders. The other thing about substance use that we found again and again is people described how they were set up to fail. People who had decades-long substance use disorders, name the substance, doesn't matter, alcohol, illicit drugs, they were invariably released on conditions, whether this was on bail or on parole, that they not use, that they abstain. Okay. Remember what I said about criminal justice, about we're going to punish you for doing things morally blameworthy? It's literally, the case law talks about that you have a choice to make. You can choose to do something you're not supposed to do. We'll punish you for doing it because you're not supposed to. Well, that's not how a substance use disorder works. Like the definition is continuing to use despite wanting to use less or stop. So setting people up to fail. We also saw folks who on entry into prison and jail, particularly on remand, this is when they're awaiting trial, horrific violence in prison, horrific violence. People, I won't even describe the type of abuse, just really awful, horrible stuff, all tied to substance use and its criminalization. Mental health is another big theme that came up. We saw that people who experience have mental health issues, substantially more likely to be stopped by police, more likely to be charged by police with non-violence and minor, what you call minor offenses, okay? More likely to be killed in police encounters. 68% of people who were killed in police encounters in Canada over the last 20 years had a mental health issue or substance use issue that was relevant at that time. So that's another huge piece. Poverty, homelessness, and unemployment. There's a book, there's a saying, the rich get rich and the poor get jail. We interviewed a lot of people, and those professionals in the system, they all agreed to be on record except for one person, and it was a criminal defense lawyer. And I'm really glad that this person agreed to still do the interview. He wanted to tell it like it is. He didn't want his name attached to it. It's a very senior defense lawyer in Canada. And I asked him, I said, hey, describe for me, like if I, as a professional person, were stopped for arrested for like a DUI, driving while impaired, okay? What would you do for me if I called you? I'm gonna call the hotshot lawyer. This would be a big deal. I could lose my job. I would, I need to beat this charge. So I don't have a big pool of money sitting here, but I can call the bank on the way to the airport and they'll give me a $40,000 line of credit, no questions asked. They will. Somebody said, whoa, do you know how much money they want to throw at you when they find you're a medical student or a law student even? They threw $100,000 at me. That was 20 years ago, 100 grand. So people are like, wow, yeah. Why? Why are they doing that? Because they know if I default that and I declare bankruptcy, I can never be on a board of directors. I will have a hard time. I couldn't do corporate law, that's for sure. Okay, so they give you just enough rope to probably hang yourself. Okay, but the point is that people of privilege have access to money even if they don't have the money. Okay, they have it. This is like a bit of the Wizard of Oz curtain coming back. Okay, and what he said is, well, if it's those charges, he's like, we're gonna, first of all, we'll clean you up. Okay, so I'm gonna get into counseling and therapy. We're gonna find the root causes of my particular issue. I'm gonna make a donation to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, make a public apology. I'm gonna go and start talking in schools. By the time the case is winding its way through the system, my lawyer's gonna go into the Crown office and present this beautiful package and go, you know what, it's not in the public interest to go ahead. It's not in the, look at this, he's not gonna do it again. Look, he's done all this great stuff. I'm disgusted at myself too, a lot of you. I didn't really do this, by the way. This is a story, right? But I could, and people do. So bringing this back to this question of poverty, homelessness, and unemployment, people who can't afford a lawyer are substantially more likely to, first of all, be denied bail. If you don't have a fixed address, even more likely. They're more likely to be charged. They're more likely to be found guilty, and they're going to get longer sentences. It's just tracks all the way through. It turns out that the average person in federal prison, when they were arrested, they were unemployed. The average person was unemployed. We lock up poor people. That's mainly who we lock up. We don't mainly lock up people who committed crimes. Now, how can I say such an egregious thing as that? Well, turns out most people who commit offenses never get identified. 2/3 of people who commit offenses, it doesn't even get reported to police. One study found that less than 1% of people who commit sexual offenses will get any kind of disposition in the criminal justice system. So well over 99% of people who commit sexual offenses don't even make it into the system. So this is why I say prison is not for criminals, because the criminals are in the community. Do you see this? Where's this going? Okay. Yeah. So the way I explain it to my students in criminal law is, you know, I'm a law professor, so you imagine I'd be a bit of a geek. Okay, like, you know, I watch Star Trek. I'll admit. Okay. There was a Star Trek episode once where they were coming in there watching this alien civilization. They're trying to learn what are they all about before they make contact. Now, I just did this thought exercise. But, you know, imagine there's some alien life form, some higher intelligence watching us right now. One of the things they would be puzzled by is why some of us are locked in cages. That would be odd. You'd be like, why is this some of them get locked up in these cages? The conclusion they would not draw, as we'll say criminologists, we're in a criminology department right now, they would not conclude based on the data of what they saw going on, that that's where people who commit crimes go to. Instead, the conclusion they would reach is that it's some combination of people who are racialized, Indigenous, Black, people of color, have substance use disorders, have mental health issues, and have experienced almost universally childhood trauma. As your research center found, we quoted in our study, it's an almost universal experience of people in this province and elsewhere to experience childhood trauma. Okay. So those are the things that you pick 2 or more of those, and that is a more likely predictor. The other reason why I can say such a ridiculous, seemingly ridiculous statement that locking people up isn't really about people who've committed crime is the vast majority of people in custody in Canada right now are being held pending trial. Okay. Now I don't have the numbers in Alberta. They're not great. Trust me. I'm going to pick on Ontario for a second because they're the worst. They're up to over 70% of everyone locked up in Ontario. Over 70%. We have the highest levels of people in pretrial custody in the G7 here in Canada. And we just passed a law approved by all the premiers in Canada from all political parties, including the NDP government in BC, saying that we need to follow a catch slogan, which was jail not bail. So this is getting worse now. Okay? New tougher bail laws to keep us all safe. Okay. So if we're going to make slogans based on rhyming, we're going to say, well, with jail we fail. Yeah. Because what I'm going to show you in a second is all the data shows that it actually makes it worse. So those are the first 4. Just briefly on the other 3, Indigenous peoples and Black Canadians. Some very similar trends around what we call over-policing and under-protection. Over-policing and under-protection. So when there's any suspicion about someone committing a crime, Indigenous people and Black people are the usual suspects. I talked to a colleague of mine at U of T, speaking in my class tomorrow as a guest lecturer, Professor Julius Hogg at U of T. He talked about riding his bike as a graduate student to U of T. Stopped by the Toronto police and asked to do a bicycle safety check. Make sure his bell works. I've never had a bicycle safety check. Okay. So what did they do? Well, they also asked him, what are you doing here? Which he took to mean, what is a racialized man doing in downtown Toronto, near U of T? He said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher. They said, what do you research? He says, police profiling. He said, really? He said, yeah, I research carding. And the officer said to him, won't you be surprised to see your effing name in the cards? And he didn't say effing. So this is how a professional, now I can tell you another anecdote, this from the other day, and again, the numbers now back this up, but when the Toronto Star first released evidence that there was racial profiling in Toronto, the police union sued the Toronto Star for billions of dollars. If they had succeeded, the settlement would have been more than the residential school settlement. That's how much the police were suing them. What do we know now? Well, a year and a half ago, the Toronto police finally admitted they could not explain the higher uses of force, the higher stops, or the higher deaths of Black people in Toronto from anything other than racism. That was the chief of police. Took him 20 years to get to that point. So some pretty serious issues. There's chapters on each of these themes in the book. Okay, so we're just kind of get your feet wet on it. Victims and survivors, I've talked about a little bit. Essentially given up on the system, right? They've walked away. For many folks, they won't go, which leaves them without support. We also talked about many people, though, who did go to the system, who were treated horrifically. One person who I interviewed for the book, and I had the pleasure of meeting in person recently on the book tour, they talked about when they reported being the victim of intimate partner violence for over 7 years, daily physical and sexual abuse. They finally came forward to police, get in the system and meet the victim services people. I'm like, oh, we're gonna get some support. No, the victim services worker in that case said horrific things to this survivor, like, why are you so dumb? Why don't you just leave him? That's from a victim services worker. And this isn't like from 30 years ago. The court appointed a counselor to work with this couple because they did want to try to still live together and try to work through this situation. That was what they wanted to do. And the male appointed court psychiatrist said to this interviewee who I spoke to, I've got some advice for you. Try not to make him so mad.
Wow.
Try not to make him so mad. So when I heard this, I was appalled too, but I didn't understand how deeply damaging that was because I hadn't lived that journey. This person who we call Sky in the book said that how they were treated by the system was worse than the abuse that they had suffered. And that was really hard for me to kind of get. But the issue was, after all that time, finally reaching out for help and having people who are supposed to help you betray that trust, just devastating, absolutely devastating. We've heard about survivors who were subpoenaed and forced to testify even when they didn't want to. Forced with threatening them with custody. They're going to go to jail if they don't testify. Okay? And so for each of these 7 themes, we tell these real stories. We give the stats, we give the research. But the other thing that this book does that I think is very different is if that's Prime Minister Harper, tell him I'll send him a free copy. You gotta have one line so your phone goes off. Don't worry, mine goes off all the time. For each of these, what we do though is it's that the system isn't broken. The system is actually perfectly designed to get the results it's getting. That's the conclusion we reached. It's not get better through tinkering. So right now in Canada, we have 2 things on offer. One is tinker with the system. We're gonna have like 1 or 2, supervised consumption sites in your city. Or, we're going to do some more training for the police to, not use force, or we're going to pass a law saying you can't racially profile. We're going to tinker with the system. That stuff doesn't work. Most of the metrics we've talked about are getting worse and worse. They're not getting better. And why is that? Because the system essentially is fueling itself. The other thing on offer is going back to those tough on crime policies. More police, sheriffs in your transit systems, shutting down supervised consumption sites, not funding them, tougher bail, longer prison terms, all this kind of stuff. So tough on crime is about more police, more punishment, more prisons. That's what it's about. And the idea is that that is how we get safety. It's not, okay? We've known this for decades across multiple jurisdictions. Here's one quote from a criminologist based at U of O. He says, if policing were the solution to crime, the more police you should have less crime. Turns out the opposite's true. We hired 100 new police officers in Vancouver, elected a tough on crime mayor. We're paying record-breaking property taxes. We're up to almost 20% over 2 years to pay for these police. And the crime's gone up. I mean, homelessness is up, crime's up. Unregulated drug deaths. Yeah, you know what he did? Yeah, he took $500,000 and he took $500,000 for 1 week to take people's tents, their tarps, and their cardboard boxes. They threw it in the garbage trucks, and I've seen it myself. They're now enforcing it. The other day I saw they got the garbage truck that would go by my house, same one, a dump truck, and a police cruiser. They're just going up and down. And the research shows that they call these decampments. The research shows that increases deaths. That people are more likely to die, particularly in a place like this where you're going to get some cold weather soon. And maybe I'm mistaken if it wasn't last year or the year before, but Edmonton had record-breaking numbers of people who died during winter and record-breaking amputations of people. Okay.
Wait till this one.
197.
197. So
Wait till this one.
so
That's
you
a
know,
life sentence.
yeah, this is the so-called solution to crime is to create more deaths. On drug busts, how many people have seen the police when they get the table with the drugs they've got? I mean, like a show and tell. Who's seen that? And this is supposed to make us all feel safer. And they'll say things like, "We took the poison off the streets." They'll take it a step further. Go, "This is the equivalent of killing 100,000 people we've saved today." Not so. The research shows that when you do those big drug seizures, it destabilizes the drug supply and it leads to an increase in deaths. And people go, "I don't trust these studies." Well, the person who wrote is a former police officer who got a PhD in criminology. So we've got to start to kind of look at whether the so-called solution is worse than the problem. So if more police isn't going to help, what about prisons? These are some of the findings that the research shows. So we looked at studies going back to as far as 1958. These are Canadian studies, not US, Canadian, involving over 300,000 people. So there's 50 studies that they looked at, and they found that it increases reoffending. People come out worse off. If you weren't a member of a gang, you're probably going to join one for your own safety. The substance use issues that you had can accelerate. The trauma that you experience inside prison makes things worse. And I mentioned that the average federal incarcerated person is unemployed when they enter federal prison. Well, they track them 14 years later after release. 14 years after release, the median income is $0. $0. So we're setting folks up for failure, and we're setting ourselves up for failure. So one of the ways that we can have these conversations is to talk about people's fundamental human rights, about reconciliation, about the evidence. Those are all important contributors. That's not convincing a lot of people, though. And so I think it's helpful to bring in some other arguments, okay? One of them is, this is a tremendous waste of money. Some people only care about their pocketbook. That's true, right? So I talk about, we had record-breaking taxes. Someone online says, let's lock them all up. Just lock them all up. I said, get out your checkbook. A single chronic offender right now costs between $2 to $3 million over the course of their lifetime. 2 to 3 million. It's an incredible waste of money as well as human potential and the lives that have been devastated. Okay? Another one is, it doesn't make us safer. It doesn't make us safer. Why? The vast majority of people are going to get out. So we're going to talk about, well, what do we do about it in just a second, but the other outcomes we've already pretty much covered. Increased suicides, increased unregulated drug deaths, and a disproportionate impact, the injustice of it all. So as I said, the ultimate conclusion that we reach here is that the system isn't broken. You can fix a broken system. It's actually designed to get these outcomes. This is about keeping people out of sight who we don't want to see. We talked about clearing East Hastings in Vancouver. Yeah, it was very politically popular for a lot of folks because they don't want to see it. They want it to go away. I don't think it would change things if, rather than it be 40,000 Canadians had died of unregulated drugs in 2016, it was 100,000. I don't think that would change anyone's mind who's not already convinced. I don't think it's about the numbers anymore. I also don't think that if, we already have well over 100 peer-reviewed studies that show that supervised consumption sites, overdose prevention sites save lives. Do you think for 1 second that if we produce another 100 that your premier is going to change your views on them? This is not about changing people's minds with evidence. The other side is really good at using narrative and stories and quick ways to make things make sense, but they're based on lies, right? So we can kind of poo-poo all day, isn't it so bad no one will read a 300-page book or listen to this hour-long podcast, but we need to get a lot better if we're concerned about changing the system and communicating about the problems and pushing back really hard every time we see these bogus solutions offered. That's a big part of it. So what could we do differently? That's what people will then say. Well, what should we do? You're saying we shouldn't have any police, we shouldn't have any prisons? Some people will say yes. I'll say yes, but there's some better ways we can do it. So in the book, I describe what I call a new transformative justice vision. Transformative justice has a long and incredible history. I've added a couple of things to how I describe it, so that's why it's called new. I'm not unaware of that important work, and this builds on it, I think. But it starts with the idea of what's our goal? What are we trying to do here? Is it to punish people? Because that's what the current system's goal is. I think the goal of our new system should be to transform the harm and trauma rather than to keep transmitting it. So I won't go through them all, obviously, but there's 7 key parts to that. And they're not just neat ideas. For each of the chapters, there's a real live working program or policy, either in Canada with the First Nation community or somewhere around the world that's actually doing it. And they're all based on a couple of things. They all get better results. That means lower offending. You have higher victim or survivor satisfaction, and they're at a fraction of the price. So the first is getting police and prisons out of what are problems like homelessness, substance use, and mental health and inequality. So just take them out, get them out completely out of those systems, and instead follow public health approaches. Let's deal with the underlying causes. So things like housing first and supportive housing. This is the dollars and cents kind of argument. It costs way more to put someone in sort of a custodial setting in a hospital, a prison, a shelter, and supportive housing. This is kind of wild. I didn't know this before. Supportive, like permanent housing, like good housing, safe housing with services around someone, that's cheaper than mats on a floor. Yep. That's kind of counterintuitive, right? The other thing with providing someone with housing is it protects them, it helps them to stay safe. There's a tremendous amount of violence done against our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness, tremendous amounts of harm. And so we can help folks. Housing first is a strategy, which is to say, we don't wait for you to figure your problems out. We put a roof over your head first, okay? Now, many folks in the room have dealt with issues in their personal life. Maybe it's a divorce, the death of someone. You know, think of something that you've had to deal with, and then imagine how much worse it would be if you were experiencing homelessness. And some of you in the room, you were experiencing homelessness when those things happened. So it sounds pretty basic, but I think we're at a point in our society where I think we need some very basic things. We need to be ensuring that every Canadian, everyone who's living in Canada, has basic access to healthy food, clothing, and shelter. You know, education, health. Like, these are basic things. And it's not about the money. It is not about the money. It's about the political will to do that. Again, look at the cost differences between these things. On the unregulated drug crisis, it really boils down to kind of 4 very simple things. If you're going to take a public health approach, you're going to take the police and the prisons out of the equation. Is safe places for people not to use alone. A regulated, safer supply so that we actually can substitute for the drugs that people are going to use anyway. So are you saying we should give people fentanyl? Yeah. You say we should give them cocaine? Yeah. Cocaine that doesn't have fentanyl in it, and benzodiazepines and tranquilizers and all that stuff. People are going to use it anyway. Okay? And there's a number of different models around how to make this work, and authorities keep squashing those. So we had a compaction club in Vancouver that was testing drugs. So people who are going to use these drugs anyway would have tested drugs. None of them died from those drugs in over a year, not one. These are people that are at high risk, but because of political pressure, the Vancouver police arrested the 2 co-founders of that group. They're called DULF, the Drug User Liberation Front. Some of you know that. Yeah. But notice something hasn't happened. The Crown has not actually charged them. That is a absolutely loser case for the Crown. Absolutely loser case. And if they did charge them, many of us believe, including myself, who again, you worked at the Supreme Court and knows a bit about constitutional law, would be the basis for kind of like a full-blown charter challenge to our drug laws. And they don't really want to do that. But because they just did the arrest move, they get to seize all their stuff and, shut it all down and do all that without any judicial process. 24/7 non-police crisis teams. Now, I understand you've kind of got this going already pretty good. No, someone said you had it going on. Okay. You do? They're with police though? Yeah. So taking the police out of it is really important. Basically, this is a group in Oregon called Cahoots, Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. And this is really neat because we can get kind of disillusioned going, oh, the government won't do this, the government won't change that. Yeah, a lot of this is government laws and policies. These guys didn't wait. This is a nonprofit organization, the Whitebird Clinic. It was doing harm reduction and support for folks who are homeless. They decided to start doing this. They started doing this outreach. So these are people who are trained medics, social workers, peers. And the police started realizing, hey, this is actually kind of helpful. So they are now integrated. They have been for over a decade. They're integrated into the 911 and non-emergency police system. They take between 15 to 20% of all those calls. They save millions of dollars because they're way less expensive than police. They should be paid a lot more. So it costs $2 million a year in Eugene for Cahoots. And they are estimated to save about $9.5 million. So what do? This is an example of how we keep everyone safe, like I said. So in Vancouver, we recently had a very serious complaint. A business owner was trying to open their shop, and there was someone who was sleeping in front of their door. This happens in Edmonton too, probably. Okay. So what are your options? Generally, it's police, fire, ambulance. Well, no fire. There's no physical health issue going on here. So that leaves you with police. So the allegation that's being investigated is that VPD showed up. This is 5 minutes from my house where this occurred. And they almost immediately began kicking that person, called them entitled and lazy, and said if they didn't get up, they're going to go to jail. The complainant in the case is not the person who was kicked, it was the business owner who called, who witnessed this. Okay. And so that's being reviewed. If you had, and we don't in Vancouver remotely anything like this, if you had an option like this, the dispatch would have sent them. No police show up, them. These folks, look at these happy people. Right? They're not like the army green camo police we have in some places that make things worse and not better in these situations. So, go a little like this, like, yeah, it's time to get up, move along, come on into the van, we've got some hot chocolate, where can we get you to? It's not going to become a police issue, right? The solution to homelessness is not police, the solution to homelessness is housing, right? So we've got to get past those. And Toronto recently announced a citywide expansion of their pilot program to make this the 4th emergency service that they're going to have starting in 2024 across the city. So it can be done, and it's being done across North America in different communities. I talked about transforming trauma. We need to support survivors and victims and actually give them the help and healing they need. In many parts of Canada, they just are not getting that. And we need to do the same for people who are caught up in our criminal justice system. This is a group of folks from Straight Up I mentioned before. We don't have time to get into it, but the key to what Straight Up does is people come to them, it's not forced, because they hear the stories of people who've gotten well. It's not just about stop doing the bad thing. They get to the roots of the trauma and pain that led folks to get involved in the justice system. They don't just look at what you did and define you by the worst thing that you did, but they actually get you in a healthy community where you drop your colors, you get out of your gang, you get into supportive treatment for your substance use issues, you learn your story, you go back to when you're as early as you can remember, and then you go back even further and start to get healing. And their goal is that you become a healthy, loving partner, a healthy parent, and a productive member of the community. And they do that. It's incredible, the stories. They're now funding their members to get tattoo removal. One of the men who spoke at our event in Saskatoon, full neck and face tattoo. Try to get a job like that, right? Yeah. Try to get a job, wonderful young man. He's trying to move on, but he can't. You got the criminal record, you got the face tattoo. So if we want to break cycles of violence, we need to support stuff like this. You show me 300 gang members who've left their gangs through the correction system. It's not happening. It's done in community. It's done with this understanding, this compassion. if you get a copy of the book, all the proceeds, the author royalties are going to two groups. One is Straight Up, and the other is to Restorative Justice Program in Ottawa, the Collaborative Justice Initiative. So there's a growing movement now that we want to try to restore harm rather than just exclude victims and punish offenders. And a growing group of survivors saying that we want to have this as an option. And so the research is pretty clear, even for violent offenses, that restorative justice has better outcomes. Lower reoffending, higher victim satisfaction, lower costs. That's a common theme in all these programs, yet they're stifled by the system. There's just two more I want to introduce, and then we'll have some time for some discussion questions on that. Rehabilitation and healing. So everyone who I spoke to, including folks who describe themselves as prison abolitionists, when I would say, okay, well, what about someone who is a serial killer or someone who is going to hurt someone tomorrow? Like, you don't really mean like zero, nothing. Well, no, kind of, okay, there'd probably need to be somewhere for someone to go if they were a significant risk to the public, right? So in this book, I call for the abolition of traditional prisons and jails. The institutions we've got right now are broken, they've never worked, and we haven't had them for all that long in the grand course of history. It really comes from Victorian England at a time where there was massive inequality in the Industrial Revolution, lots of homelessness, lots of poverty. Sound familiar, you know? So I think we need to get rid of those. And for the much smaller number of folks who would need to be separated from society for a time, the goal should be that they get better, not worse. And so there's issues with all these different models, but I think there's some inspiration to be had from countries like Norway. These are real photos. None of this is clip art. Looks like a college campus inside. You can see the walls, you know, you're not getting out, but inside the idea is to be based as normal as possible. So I had a dorm room like this at University of Toronto. They look just like this, except this is a bigger window that they have in Halden Prison. Mine was like this big, okay? There's a contact officer, they're called. They're not called a guard, a contact officer playing beach volleyball. Look at this guy. He looks scary, doesn't he? Look at those, like, come on. That's how we judge people, isn't it? He looks real tough. He's got a tattoo, and these guys must be wanting to shank their guards all the time. No, it turns out the use of force and violence here is an exception. It's very rare. It's very rare. So why did Norway go this route? Well, they used to have a very similar system to ours, but they had a series of prison riots and guards were killed, and they decided to do things different. So they followed this route, a more compassionate, humane approach. And the outcomes speak for themselves. I mean, they went from having reoffending rates, much like we have, 60 to 70% reoffending down to just 20%. Now, when I shared this with a couple of journalists and they've read the book and they said to me, hey, I can see the attack ads now. You know, if any government did this, they're soft on crime and all that. And I said, no, you know how I would do this? First of all, I would not hide these photos. I would put them up in the window. I'd be like, this is what we're going to do. We are going to do pottery classes and yoga for people who are locked up. And you are going to get a better result. I wouldn't hide that. The second thing that I would do is I would start doing this with our youth facilities. That public, I believe, would get on side immediately in every province in the country. Everyone can get behind the idea of not caging children. Okay, that's where you start. Then what happens is you get these great outcomes, and two things happen. One is it can build support for doing this in the adult system. And secondly, the youth system is the pipeline for the adult system. It is the pipeline. So many people we talked to, they began getting locked up literally, you know, shouldn't say literally, but when they were 12, I'd like to say literally all of them on their 12th birthday, but then some of it really was a fact. Yeah. Pretty much, okay, pretty much, 12 years old. And they described their time, many of them in youth custody, as among the worst.
Oh, yeah.
That surprised me because they were children. One person we interviewed for the book, she was locked up between ages 12 and 39 for 25 years. In and out, starting age 12. When I first started asking her about her youth time, she said, oh, wasn't that bad? I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'll hear a good story. She goes, I said, well, what was good about it? She said they fed us really well. We had 3 meals a day. And sometimes we even got a snack. Oh, well, yeah, but then the guards would lock me up in the rubber room when I misbehaved. That happened a lot. She said, I said, well, what did that look like? What did you do to misbehave? I had images of some prison riot. She said, well, like when I would swear at the guards. She'd swear at the guards, they'd lock her in isolation as a child. It's sick. It's sick the way that we're treating kids. So I believe we should have a moratorium on building any more new places of incarceration. We should be shutting down the ones we have. We should be transitioning to something like this. The last thing I'll mention is Indigenous justice is a really key part of a new system. You cannot fix or transform the current settler system for Indigenous people. That's what we heard again and again from the Indigenous leaders we spoke to, from the Indigenous folks who are incarcerated in the system. The numbers are absolutely staggering at this point. I got the numbers in Alberta. I don't have them memorized, so I can find them real quick. But we're at the point now where the federal system, we have 32% of all people in federal custody are Indigenous. 32%. Among federally incarcerated females, 50% are Indigenous. 50. It gets worse from there. In Alberta, I said it was 32 for all folks. In Alberta, it's 40% of people in custody in Alberta are Indigenous. In provinces like Manitoba and Saskatchewan's up to 80%. That's an actual count. 80% of all people in custody in Saskatchewan, Indigenous. It got worse. You're like, how could it get worse than 80%? It gets worse. We kept drilling down and down and down. Our team, our students who worked on this project were like a dog with a bone when they got a hold of this stuff, okay? We went down further down the rabbit hole. It turned out that in 2019, 2020, every single youth in custody in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan who was female, Indigenous. Every single one, 100%. 100%. So when people say that our prisons and jails are like the new residential schools, or as we're starting to hear Indigenous leaders call it, a genocide, it's not an exaggeration. I mean, put yourself in any other country. Just imagine some country X, and you heard that these numbers. Yeah, sure, pick any other country. Pick the numbers of people who are incarcerated. You're going to go, this is wrong. This is wrong. This is sick. It's not justice. So what needs to happen is Indigenous people have, for millennia, kept their communities safe. It's not like something new that they need to figure out how to do, but the disruption that colonialism has done has been severe. We talked to a number of different Indigenous nations about what they're doing, and the results are incredible. I mean, those Indigenous communities that have their own Indigenous-led peacekeeping and policing had a 25% reduction in violent crime. And they're not waiting for permission. Many of them start their own peacekeeping forces. The last one is, well, what about the sort of correctional side of things? This is a real photo from a federal institution in Quebec. Like I could have picked one from the Shawshank Redemption and it wouldn't look this bad. This is not where people get better, right? They get worse. This is a healing lodge here in Alberta. You know, these are very different environments, different philosophies. But as with Indigenous policing or peacekeeping, Indigenous corrections chronically underfunded, and still underfunded. So with these healing lodges, like this one in Alberta, if they're run by Corrections Service Canada, they're funded at this level. If they're run by an Indigenous nation, they're funded at this level. On a per capita basis, they're being set up to fail. So it's not that we don't know how to have a safer society for everyone, or a more equitable society. The solutions are there. They're working. But most of us have never heard of them. And we're spending our time tinkering with the current system. So our goal for this book is that it opens up a conversation nationally and in your community about new and better ways to address harm in our society, rather than these failed approaches that are going to keep making things worse. So thanks very much for your time. So I think we have time for some questions, and I'll pass the mic around. This mic is for the recording, so you'll just get there. Before I do that, if you'd like a copy of Indictment, like I said, all the proceeds are donated, so that's why I have no problem like flogging it. You're like, hey, he's not getting any money out. So there's a discount code from University of Toronto Press for 25% off. Is today the 27th? Yeah. It's the last day of their Black Friday sale too, if you want to get a digital copy for 40% off. Here's the podcast, same title, And please reach out and contact me. I'd love to stay in touch. We were able to get a few copies of the book today. These are for $25. It's usually $33. So if you want a copy, yeah, just come and grab one. There's a slip for sending me an e-transfer.
Thank you.
We have a little running contest of the honor system. And at the end, I'll let you know which city was the most honest. You know what I mean there, right? So far, Montreal's winning. I won't tell you which city is not doing so good right now. Okay. I'll see they're going like, okay, son. Yes, here's your microphone. Last one. Okay, there you go. Chapters, Indigo has tons of them. It's for this.
Okay, gotcha. I was just curious if you entered none of it. Because currently none of it is, I believe, leading right now in injustice. Yeah.
Thanks. We didn't have anyone from Nunavut who responded to our ads. Ours are like responsive, right? But I have spoken with a couple of folks up there, and in particular who are working on this issue, justice reform. So while I was still writing the book, we were having back and forth and sharing what we found. We also had someone who shared with us about just sort of Inuit law around like how does harm get addressed. And so in the section on Indigenous justice, to make sure people don't have a sense that like, oh, Indigenous justice is all the same. It's all just like kind of restorative, like this pan-Indigenous thing. We were like, no, there's 4 different nations laws that we kind of profile a little bit just to give a flavor of it. And Inuit law is one of them as well. Yeah.
And then I just have, recently, San Francisco held a big meeting where they invited the guy from China. And apparently, they cleaned up their streets of encampments in less than 24 hours for this gentleman to come to their country. And then after he had gone and left, the community noted that they were missing at least half of their community members, just up and gone. So I fear, what happens in the United States will eventually come down here, right?
Yeah.
And the way that our chief of police has just declared war on our brothers and sisters on the street with decampments, saying that he's not going to tolerate any more decampments or tents in the city of Edmonton. And we're seeing it right now on the streets. On my organization, we're a voluntary-led organization, and we get grants from not government, from other areas. And we go on the street 7 times in a week, and we notice that, yes, our brother, just last night, for instance, I entered a tent where everybody was crying. And I asked why, because today is their decampment day, and they didn't know where they were going to go.
Yeah.
And what's really deplorable is that it's a woman with her children. And what the government did was they took her children and put them in a group home because they were unhoused. And then they allowed mother to pitch up a tent a few blocks away from the group home so that she could still, her kids could still visit her. And we see this kind of stuff all of the time. 3 generations in one tent, 4 generations in one tent. And it's all Indigenous women, and right now what we see too is children who have, and I say children because 18, especially if you've been coddled all your life by the government, you're a child of the government. When you turn 18, you're certainly not an adult because you're not given the life skills a parent would give you. And so how do we, and that's what I'm seeing on the street right now, a bunch of youth that have no direction, that cling to the so-called gang life because that's the love that they see on the street.
Yeah.
And we have, that's the big growing number right now, and I don't know how to help them. And that's what's really troubling right now. And there are future generations, and I can't help but feel this is by design. This is where they want us Indigenous people on the street. So how can we better combat all of this and save our people, save our future generations?
Thanks, thank you so much for sharing. What was your name?
Judith Gale.
Judith, yeah. Judith, you asked me how you could. I think you're doing everything you can. You're there, you know, and you're bearing witness to what's happening, and you just shared it with all of us too, and you're stirring me up. I mean, I'm outraged. I'm outraged. It's disgusting. This is not the kind of country I want to live in, where people are being treated like they're disposable.
Yeah.
And, you know, to your police chief and to the other police officers who are participating and calling for people's only homes they have. That's what that tent is for them right now. That's their home.
And their belongings.
That's everything they have.
You know, I belong to the coalition of human rights and justice, and we took an action against the city through litigation.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you know, we had asked that the matter get seen in November, and the great city of Edmonton has pushed it to January. Yeah. And in that short time, that span, November, December, January, we're gonna see how many deaths on the street, how many amputations on the street, how many people dying every day, and they don't care. You know, when we could quite easily take care of the matter today. Today was actually the day, the 27th, that we thought that we would be in court.
Yeah.
You know, and then we would get the injunction for them to stop that bylaw 2022. And they pushed it till January, and they don't care that there's real live human beings who are gonna die.
It's sick, and you know, they're doing it as political leaders and as police leaders because they are hearing that's what other people want. It would be bad enough if it were just like a rogue mayor or police chief in a given city who's pushing this. What's more disturbing is there's people who support them for that and are calling for them to do it. So what I learned over years in politics is leaders don't lead, they follow. They're following what the community is saying. And so we've got to get out in the community. The litigation route is an important one. I'm sorry to hear they pushed it back, because we had a study done in BC of similarly all these injunctions that were brought to try to clear places where people were living in temporary shelters. And what it's called rush to judgment, if anyone's interested. What they found is the courts were very quick to give those interim injunctions, those initial ones, and say, yeah, clear people out. But when it finally got to the actual case to be heard in full, the police and the cities were losing those cases. They were overwhelmingly losing them. So getting a proper full hearing, there's a ton of case law which says that what is being done is unconstitutional. If there is not a shelter space for that person on a one-to-one basis, they're not allowed to do this. So so it's a bit of a weird thing to say, but they are breaking the higher law of Canada, the Constitution, already. When the court eventually gets a hold of this, they look back in time and say they broke the law then. So these are lawless actions now. Like what they're doing is wrong now, but we can't prove it until it gets to a court. So in the meantime,
what about the dead bodies that we find in tents?
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that proof enough?
It should be. Yeah, I think about other ways to try to change opinion here. And as a lawyer, there's ways to do it. There's someone who's like got a beating heart and cares deeply what you're saying. Those take me two ways. One is a class action lawsuit by the families of people who died. You hit governments in the pocketbook. I'll tell you, even a very hard-edged conservative government who gets a multi-million-dollar, $500 million litigation for wrongful death, which is what it would be. It's a wrongful death lawsuit. And you have some incredible lawyers in this province, and this is the kind of route you may need to go. And that's where you hit them hard, because they're going to keep doing this. And some some court is gonna approve that. And I'll tell you about class actions from having worked in government on the other side. As soon as the class action gets certified, which means you don't even have the full hearing, that already gets the attention. That gets massive. It's even just filing it. So there needs to be a very serious shot over the bow of police chiefs and municipal governments who are killing people. Like the research is clear and the lived experience you're talking about is real. So that's one piece. The other part that I go to as just a beating heart human being is I think we need to do a better job as a community of bringing people in the conversation and bringing awareness about them who aren't here today, who are not on board with, more compassionate, evidence-based ways of dealing with it. One of the things I've been doing is I've been going up talking to church groups. So that's a group of folks who you're like, 2/3 of Canadians say they identify as a Christian. I do, and I went through a real change of heart. I was one of those people who looked down on people. I was one of the people who, when Jesus told a story, he talks about the Pharisee who's like thinks he's better than everybody else, teacher of the law, my professor, that hits close to home, and a tax collector who was like the worst of the worst. He's like he betrayed his people, and he's a tax collector to boot. And the story he tells, I told in church, and I said, "Are you like the Pharisee or the tax collector?" The Pharisee comes to the front and goes, "Hey, thank you, God. I'm not like those." All making a martyr. And thank you, I'm not like those drug addicts and those homeless people. Thank you, I'm not like those people I see on the side of the street, those bums, those unemployed. I work hard for all that I get and I donate to charity. I'm modernizing the story here. Okay. It says, but then the tax collector wouldn't even enter the synagogue, wouldn't even enter. He stood at the back, he looked down, he beat his chest, and he said, "God have mercy on me, a sinner." And Jesus said only one of those two people went home right. So I tell this story from the Bible to Christians in a church on a Sunday morning, talking about these issues. And I have had people come up after and contact me and say, "I was like you were. I have looked down on folks. I thought it was a matter of pull up your bootstraps. I grew up in Alberta. I grew up on the personal responsibility thing, drinking that Kool-Aid. And it was only by a real change of heart that I would change my mind." I also quote other stuff. Jesus says, "I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me water. I was in prison and I was sick and you came and visited me. And whenever you did that for the least days, you did it for me." So I think there is a strong moral, faith-based argument that can be made by people that are part of these communities. You also can see it within Jewish communities, within Islam, within Buddhism. There's a whole bunch of different perspectives that I'm not part of those communities. So I'm not the people to speak into those different communities. But for those of you who are, think about there's people that you can reach with your message that I can't. And vice versa. I also went and gave a talk at the Fraser Institute about this. And you know what the title was? It was, "Are we getting good value for our public safety money?" So I'm not in there talking about human rights and certainly not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about dollars and cents. You're wasting billions of dollars. You guys don't like wasting, you like money? You don't like wasting money? I heard that about you? Yeah. Tell us how to save some money. Here's how you can save some money. And they were into it. The people that were in that room were into it. So I think the approach is to build a broad coalition of folks. The community of folks who work on substance use issues is doing more work with the homeless advocates. That wasn't the case from what I could see, at least nationally, until very recently. And I think there's a lot of other groups that would build a bigger movement for change, because that's what I think has to happen. We can keep talking more about this after, but thank you for coming. How much time do we have left? Is Sandra, are you running out of time, or should we?
We have a job project too.
Two, okay, great. So 5 more minutes, maybe? Okay. Yeah. And I'm not the job talk candidate. I'm telling you the city. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Let's see.
Just really quickly, my question's around housing and housing first that you touched on briefly in your presentation. In this city, and I'm sure in some others, this is kind of like with everything here, kind of become a bit of a polemic. And our chief, for example, is quite open about not believing in housing first and being quite in opposition of that strategy, I guess. So my question is, we've seen more organizations pop up dedicated to the mission of abolishing homelessness. We've seen organizations that are dedicated to providing affordable housing. And I'm kind of wondering how we reconcile the progress that has already been made up to this point in achieving all this housing for people who need it, but also the issues that still persist within housing first. I understand that one of the big issues in the city, and I imagine elsewhere, is once you get into the housing, there's a bunch of rules put in by the landlord about maybe you can't have guests over, maybe you can't have drug use, this, and people are getting kicked out just as quickly as they're being brought in.
Yeah.
Including maybe some other effects like their damaged deposits not being returned and things like that. So I'm wondering if that's the point of reconciliation, that I'm not sure, like, how should we look at this issue, because we're still depending on things like the free market, the housing market, and in a private landlord, and we're at their mercy, and they clearly people are still suffering within these things. So I'm wondering, like, from where we are now, if housing first really is the option. I mean, how do we go from where we are now, acknowledging how far we've come, but also where we need to go in this strategy?
Yeah. So I'm a criminal law professor, so I'm not a housing expert. So what I say is get the criminal law out of the housing issue. If we start with that, that is already a contribution. So I can confidently say within my area of expertise, we need to do that. And it's like, oh, sorry, what was that? The police chief's talking about homelessness and housing? No, that's not your job. Stay in your lane. Your lane is people getting stabbed and shot. That's your lane. You stay out of the lane. If there's someone in a mental health disturbance, oh, that's not you either.
Yeah.
There's someone who's homeless, that's not you. That's not you. Stick to your lane. And I think there's real value in political pushback. People underestimate this, but there's value in the pushback. It's exhausting work. I said I'm not housing expert, but I've been learning more in that. And one of the things that I would say is I think we're at a point where we need to have public funding for housing, but administered through supportive organizations in the community that will do the actual work. I think that's the right balance. We already know that the governments do not do a good job of caring for people, for example, youth. We should not be doing that model. I think it's organizations that are already doing the work that can do more of it and better, but with that funding. And I think we need the whole spectrum. You need the whole range. You need to have that low barrier housing, that you're not being evicted, because you're using substances. You should have some housing that has like a supervised, overdose prevention site, or a witness use room, or an safe inhalation room. There's folks who are not, don't want to be in a building with that because where they're at on their journey, that would be a triggering thing for their recovery. Some other options. One of the biggest things we see is the not in my backyard is a big one. So everyone says they want the housing, but no one wants it anywhere near them, right? So this is a big one. And when I grew up in Calgary, we had a trailer. One of my best friends lived in a trailer home park in Calgary. So, Calgary Dalhousie Station, where they put the C train. That used to be a mobile home park. It was a big park. It was very low income housing. There was lots of kids riding on their bikes. It was a safe, fun place. I mean, it was a great place. And we don't have it anymore. Like there's none of that sort of stuff. It's like all the new housing that's going in has got, nice fixtures and it's beautiful places, but it's not being provided to people who need it. So I think the housing issue is a much bigger nut to crack than I can possibly offer solutions. But I would take the same approach that we did for this. I would say, let's talk to some folks who've experienced homelessness and precarious housing, and let's hear from them what they think would help, and talk to the organizations that are on the ground and working on it, and start to make some similar types of arguments here around what will be, cost effective and so forth. But I do worry. The other side of this is maybe these problems don't get better. Maybe they get worse. Maybe no one listens. Maybe I'm wasting my time. Maybe you're wasting your time. There's two reasons why I don't totally buy into that. One is I know that at the individual level, that people's lives do change when people are caring towards them and compassionate. That there are people right now, despite these cruel systems, who we can help. And the second thing is, I think we need to be speaking up about this while it's happening. One of the things I look back at the residential school system is that there were people who were speaking up. There were at the time. There should have been more of them, but there were, and they were not silent. And our silence is complicity in this stuff. It really is.
Silence is violence.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And so I think that's really important that these leaders will be held to account one day. And whether it's, I don't want it to wait for the history to judge them, they can be judged today by their actions. I think we're out of time, but I'm gonna stick around for a few minutes later. And yeah, did you want to?
Do you mind that if I just say a couple quick things?
Sure, yeah, please.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank Councillor Jantz for supporting us today in this event, and also for filming it. So we'll have the tape for others to watch, so it goes beyond the room here. Yeah.
Hi, folks. My name's Reed. I work for Councillor Jan's municipal politician here in the city. This entire event has been live streamed onto Michael's YouTube. It has been debranded, so it's not branded a Michael broadcast, so you can share it quite extensively without worrying about, do I care about Michael? On a different note, though, one of the key topics that we talked about today is figuring out how to communicate this message on a more broad scale. That's kind of one of my key components of my job, is figuring out how we get political momentum behind these ideas, and sharing this video directly with your elected representatives makes a very large impact. You'd be quite shocked how many just like direct written emails. We all love bots, we all love clickety quick things, but I'm telling you right now, if you take the time to look up who your representative is, send this video or something like it to them, it will likely make a difference in outcomes quite quickly. There's like 60 emails in here, it will change a politician's mind. I can say that quite definitively, at least at the local level. Province, it might be fucked. But getting the police chief to change his mind is going to be coming down to local folks. I know there's other people in this room who are working on those efforts on like communicating that mission too. So I'm connected with them, and hopefully this can continue. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
One thing to all of the people, that we indigenous of this land are never homeless on our own land, okay? We're not homeless, we're unhoused.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I can stick around for a few minutes, but they have an event, so if we want to carry on in the hallway, I'm happy to do that. Thanks for